Hello, everybody. Today we have a task ahead of us, and that is to fix global poverty. A very simple thing to do. I don't know why it hasn't been done already. It just feels like every time I do this every year with the class, they just never actually solve poverty. But this is the year. I have a good feeling about you guys. You're going to fix poverty. So what we want to talk about first is we want to talk about sort of how we measure poverty and what we're really talking about. And then we're going to talk about four different sets of theories about how to fix poverty. And then you guys are going to tell me what to do to solve poverty. Perfect. And then we'll just do it. We'll solve poverty and we'll move on with our lives. So we start with economic development. Development is a weird word. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. I'm going to give you a particular definition. It is not the best definition, but it is a definition. The progressive improvement of the human condition. Sometimes we'll talk about the term with this well-being, improvement of well-being. But again, all these things sort of beg a lot of questions about what this sort of means. So what we often fall back on is we often fall back on economic development. Because here's the thing about economic development. We can easily measure economics. It's hard to measure, say, happiness, or it's even hard to measure health. It's hard to measure well-being. But I can sort of say if I'm making, $10,000 this year and next year I'm making $20,000, there's an improvement, right? It's an easy measure. And so economic development is often where we fall back on this. But when we're talking about development, we're meaning a whole range of things. Like, for example, there's more clean water rather than less clean water, fewer people catching malaria, etc. Things like that. But economic well-being, again, becomes the way we tend to define these things. These are processes of positive change. We're not just talking about change here. We're talking about change in a direction that we consider positive. Now, this is starting to get this sort of story again. Remember that things are getting better. It's very much that liberalism story, and that's not coincidental. This is definitely a part of this idea that essentially we're trying to make things better, move along this line here. The idea of this movement along the line is what we actually call progress. So what's the goal? Now, of course, we know that the goal for liberalism is greater and greater freedom. And honestly, that's still kind of the goal of development as well. That if I'm making more money, I have more choices about my own good life. I have more freedom to choose. If I have less money, I have less freedom to choose. If I have better health, I have more freedom to choose. If I'm constantly sick, I have less freedom to choose. So these things are interrelated. I wouldn't want to say they're the exact same thing, but they're definitely interrelated. There is a path to the goal. Now, the conversation that comes up, especially when we're talking about development and economic development, is there one path or are there many paths? I'll just tell you this right off the bat. The sort of standard model about development in the world right now is there's really one path to development, and that is free market capitalism. And possibly, if things are going okay, you can add democracy to that. Again, not a big surprise about the liberalism idea here. All right, so how do we measure this? How do I know that things are getting better? So I want you to think about this in your own life. Like, let's say that you come back to school 10 years from now, and you want to, and I ask you, are things going better for you than they were when you were here? Like, how would you answer that question? Like, what evidence would you give me? I want you to just pause and think about that for a second. What evidence would you give me 10 years from now that things are better for you? You're pausing right now. Okay. All I can do is tell you the things that people have said in the past. I got a job. I got a cool job. I got a promotion. I'm making good money. I have a family. But not just I have a family, I have a happy family. I have a healthy family. I have 1.5 kids, things like that. I've traveled. These are sort of the ways that we sort of measure this. Now, how do we measure economic development if we're talking about a country? And it's going to be kind of the same things. It's going to be things that we can measure, which isn't exactly telling us that things are better. It's just telling us that the things we can measure are better. So one of the big things we turn to is this thing called gross domestic product. And GDP is just the amount of money that's circulating in the economy. So the more Americans are spending, the more GDP of America is. And then we sort of translate that into there's economic growth. You can't see me doing quotes over here. I'm doing a lot of quotes. This works great. The problem with this is take a country like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a fairly high GDP, but if you actually go around Saudi Arabia, a lot of people are super poor. It's because the money that's moving around Saudi Arabia has to do with oil, which means 99% of the people aren't touching that money. It's just a few people who are really rich who are making the GDP look like strong. So that doesn't really measure what we want to measure. So we have a new measure called Human Development Index, HDI. This combines three different elements. You guys who are in geography, take a second, pause, and see if you can remember the three things that go into HDI. For the rest of us, there's three things. Number one is going to be income, GDP. The second element that's going to go into this, we're going to again, take these numbers and mix them together, and out pops this number. It's called an index. If you haven't taken scoping methods, that's what an index is. We're going to out pop this new number. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in life expectancy at birth. Now, this is not a perfect measure, but what this is going to measure, this is going to sort of measure the health of people. If life expectancy at birth increases, we would expect other areas of healthcare to increase as well. There's more nutrition, there's more medical services, things like that. And then the third one's going to be educational attainment, which I think is measured in terms of literacy. I don't have that in front of me right now, but I think that's what it is. Again, it's not that education or literacy in and of itself sort of makes us better off, but if there's more of that, we would assume other things in that area as well. And this sort of kind of lines up with what we think of, Ben Franklin's sort of healthy, wealthy, and wise. These are sort of the things that we kind of want. And then what we do is we take these numbers and we kind of classify countries. So there are developed countries, the West. We would say, for example, the United States, European Union, probably throw Australia on there, Japan, South Korea, a couple others, but that's about it. And then you have the least developed countries, LDCs, and that's the third world countries, Burkina Faso and a bunch of other states. And again, you saw from that video from Jeffrey Sachs sort of how the world sort of looks with the sort of the most developed and the least developed in there. And then there's a third category, which are developing. And we put China, India, Brazil, there's a few other countries we put in there. Now, there are question marks about like how developed or developing these are. All we're saying is that if here's developed, here's underdeveloped, the developing states are somewhere in this here at varying degrees. So you might say, well, Brazil feels pretty developed, so maybe it's up here. But then I go to certain places in Brazil and I go, whoa, maybe it's not very developed. And so that's part of the thing, is it's on the path towards development. We could imagine in 50 years these countries will be sort of in this category, but right now they're not, and they're definitely not this. So those are our categories. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through 4 theories. I will just give you guys a little spoiler alert here. The first theory we talk about is going to be the one that is the dominant theory in the world. If you go to the World Bank, if you go to the United States, if you go to the EU, if you go to the UN, this is the one that is the primary thing that is talked about when it's fixing development. I'll also say before we move on that no one theory sort of stands on its own. Most people would hold to a mix of 2 or 3 of these. That being said, the question is not whether they're all good ideas. The question is, if you only have so much money and time and energy that you're devoting towards fixing poverty in, let's say, Africa or someplace like that, where do you spend your money first? Are you following me on this? So again, there's some good elements in all of these theories, but where do you start? And then what comes next and next and next? But where should we be focused on right this moment? All right. So here is the first theory